your surge is sort of really cool because you have this amazing surge talent and buff and like what's going on. I don't know. I'm probably going to be stoned for this. And people on the forums are certainly going to stone me for it. But I actually gear my healers much more according to taste than according to a spreadsheet. And this is like absolute heresy for a theory crafter. But the truth of it is,
are you saying taste for the healer or taste for the class?
Taste for the
play
healer.
style.
Okay, so the individual
and fights, yeah.
Me as opposed to you.
Exactly, yeah. So here's my reasoning for this. Healing is not DPS. With DPS, more damage is better. Just straight up, more damage is better. With a healer, more healing is not actually better. It's great to have your ceiling raised, and that's what gear does, but your healing is dependent on the fight. And your healing is not only dependent on the fight, but it's dependent on the phase of the fight, right? Because some fights, your sustained healing is going to be fairly low, but there's just going to be that like 12 seconds of, oh my gosh, someone is taking, 20K hits over and over and over again. Holy cow, I have to keep up with that, right? So healing is about burst, it's about control, and it's not so much about your ceiling. So for my healer, I like to run, I should talk pre 3.0. For my commando healer, I liked to run about a 50-50 split of Surge and Alacrity, a little bit more Alacrity than Surge, I think. And I ran, I think, about 460 crit, something like that. Maybe 500 crit, somewhere in there. This was categorically not the spreadsheet optimal distribution. It really, really wasn't. Spreadsheet optimal distribution would have had me at less crit and less Alacrity, I think. No, less Surge. And that was just, you could calculate it. I saw the math. I did the math. I knew what was optimal, but I liked it better where I had it. And I think the same thing is true now. You want your healer to feel comfortable. You want to feel like when you activate that heal, you know how much the red bar is going to move. And if it crits, you know how much it's going to crit for and how often it's going to crit. So you can predict that and plan around it. Well, predict in air quotes, right? But you can plan around it if it happens. That is what is important for healing. And so honestly, like there's certain guidelines that I would give to healers. Don't stack defense rating, for example. But beyond that, I would say it's very a la carte. Like if it feels good to you, it's optimal. Go with it. And tiny little, even marginally high differences in max HPS, like 100, 150 max HPS that you're giving up, no one cares. What matters is what you're able to do in that moment when someone is dying and you have to heal them. Do you have control of your class? Do you have the self-possession and the potential to be able to do that? And if the answer is yes, then your gear is good.
Oofalong?
Well, the only thing I'd comment on that is, and it was a nuanced point, but I think it's one that's really important. The stats that you pick up, the percentage crit or the percentage surge or whatever that you pick up from your discipline track is additive. So decisions about gearing are, for the most part, irrespective. I guess we could just say they're irrespective of what you're picking up in your discipline tree. So just, in other words, just because you have plus 10% more surge to all of your heals, don't think about that as, hey, I don't need to stack surge rating, because that's not at all true. In this case, it actually is beneficial, but in some cases it may not be beneficial, but it's definitely not a detriment, just because you're picking up that fixed percentage somewhere else.
Right, so 30% surge from surge rating is still going to be an additional 30% surge even if you're getting 50% surge from your discipline.
Correct.
So instead of being at 30% surge for somebody that has no surge from their discipline, you're going to be at 80% surge, and that's going to be phenomenal. Okay, so for the surge rating, what would be the value for the quote-unquote cap, the double point for the surge rating?
I think the half value is right around 400, 410, something like that. That's not, calling that a cap is really disingenuous, but it is the half value where the stat is giving you half of the value per point that it gave you when you had 0. But I think, so with tertiary stats, things are weird, right? So pre 3.0, because Alacrity wasn't worthwhile, once we got to our accuracy cap, we just basically dumped the rest in Surge, regardless of the diminishing returns, because
Alacrity is worthless.
Alacrity was worthless for a lot of people, and there was just nowhere else to put those points. You can't trade Surge for power. It would be fantastic if you could, but you couldn't. Now that Alacrity, holy cow! Now that Alacrity is valuable,
That's a great stat coming out in 4.0.
Yeah, Alacrity is the stat that I'm going for all the way.
Now that Alacrity is something that's very interesting, and the sort of conceptual diminishing return ceiling on Alacrity is so much higher. I don't know. Barring the math on this is very nascent, right? People are still working on this, but it's my intuition is that I will probably never in the 3.0 tier take a DPS character above 450 Surge. Like that's probably whatever rounds to around there. I'm probably just going to sit at that and just keep dumping stuff into Alacrity, because Alacrity has so much of a ceiling, and it's basically just a percent increase on your DPS.
Yeah. So keep in mind that unless you're messing with your augments, which is probably not ideal for this Surge versus Alacrity, you only have 4 slots that you're playing with, because we've devoted the rest of those to accuracy. So, your decision is pretty, discrete. You go with 1 piece of Alacrity or 2 pieces of Alacrity. And to start out with, or 0, I guess, right? I mean, so there's not that many options that you have. And at most, said another way, at most you could have up to 4 pieces of Surge. So, that puts you at your 440 based on 192 gear right now, kind of that, 450 number that you threw out there, Keyboard Ninja. So, that seems like a good place to start. At most, do 1 piece of Alacrity, 1 Alacrity enhancement. Is probably a sufficient place to start, just because Surge, that gives you 330 points in Surge, which is a very nice place for each one of those.
Okay. So, let's see. I think we've covered all the basic stats, and we've covered the basics for tanks. I feel like we could do an entire interview, Keyboard Ninja, about tanks on its own.
Oh my gosh.
Which, going back to the start of this, I was shocked to hear you say that you thought that the tanking side was easier or more straightforward. There's no way that's true. There are so many more variables, and because I know what you've done with your modeling on it is you're actually trying to take into account damage profiles of each boss. So once you factor that in, like, it becomes not infinitely, but significantly more complex than DPS, which I always just said was like about optimizing or maximizing your damage. And I don't know if there's a single DPS model out there that is taken into account, well, during this 6 seconds I don't get to attack because I have to run around, therefore I should adjust my stats slightly. Maybe somebody's doing it to that granularity, but I guess I'm not aware of that. So I was shocked to hear you say that you thought tanking was more straightforward than DPSing or healing, because at least from a theory crafting perspective, because it doesn't appear.
So from a theory crafting perspective, the basic level of tank theory crafting requires so little data. You basically just need your character sheet and the fundamental formula for 1 minus damage reduction multiplied by 1 minus defense multiplied by 1 minus shield times absorb. You can just work in terms of that, and you can get so far looking just in terms of that formula. Where you start needing boss profiles is when you want to take into account the different damage types, right? Where you need to know, how much of this fight is actually subject to defense, how much is subject to shield. And then that's where things start getting a little bit more complicated, but it's still not that crazy, right? You just need a little bit of data from the fight. You need a little bit of math to calculate the pre-mitigation DTPS, and you're pretty much done, right? I actually have a script that will do this, and I can just feed it a combat log, and out pops these numbers for me. It's very, very easy. With DPS, though, you basically need to look at every single ability individually, and you need to look at, what is the variance in this ability? What is the min and max value? All of that stuff. Like the spreadsheets that I have for calculating DPS and HPS based on theoretical models are so much more complicated than the spreadsheets that I have for calculating tanking stuff. And I think the tanking stuff can get very complicated. So there's 2 areas where it can get really insane, right? Area number 1 is some of the tanking proc effects are actually very non-trivial to calculate their stochastic value. So Dark Bulwark, for example, because the value of Dark Bulwark depends on how good you are at keeping your kinetic bulwark up or your dark ward up, and how often you're getting hit, and then it's this really complex binomial regression to figure out what the exact value is. Another example is what is the value of power screen versus energy blast, right? Where is that value there? And because that depends on your rotation, it depends on how often you're defending and shielding. Those sorts of things get very complicated. Another area where it gets complicated that I'm still sort of developing is, this formula that I gave, the 1 minus damage reduction, 1 minus defense, 1 minus shield. That's calculating mean mitigation. It completely ignores health. It completely ignores burst phases in fights and things like that. So I have this much more complicated analysis that I'm trying to do now called probability of kill, where I look at, okay, this is an ability that the boss does, and it does it this often. So I have to survive this many of them. What is the probability of me dying to that ability, given everything else that's going on in the fight? And that can become enormously complicated. But I think just baseline tank theory crafting it's a much lower entry level than DPS or healer theory crafting.
That's interesting because I was going to throw this out there, assuming we got onto it, but I just observed that because if you read the tanking forums, there is much less consensus, and there are a lot of people who disagree with Keyboard Ninja's way of modeling tanking, and but they're not necessarily proposing alternatives. They just say that that's not the right way to think about it. So you'll find there's always the tank somewhere out there that says, I stack endurance because it's all about, staying alive. And yes, that's sort of true. And, there's just lots of different things you can optimize.
I can speak to that personally because I decided what the hell, just stack endurance, and I can tell you it does not make you more survivable, and it definitely pisses your healers off.
It is. It's complex, and the new stuff that you've done, I'm excited about. I haven't had the time to really look into it and really, understand it as much as I would like. But yes, it does address this. I don't mean to call it a shortcoming in your previous work, but this concept of health matters, and as we said, there's a lot of things that you can't resist, and then there's a lot of so there's just lots of other factors to consider. And I think one of the interesting challenges with tank theory crafting is there's perhaps not one right answer. I think there's DPS, there's a discrete answer, there's clear differences between this is obviously superior to that. And in tanking, because there are so many elements to the fight and so many different attacks that you have to plan for instance, would you rather take a big spike of damage and rely on the healers to heal you during that brief 6 seconds, or would you rather take more damage over the duration of the fight, taxing them at a more even time? That's a subjective decision. Hopefully it's something that you guys as a group have determined what to do. But that's where I think some of the tanking becomes more complicated, to try and understand and figure out what you want. What are you trying to actually solve? I think that's one of the big things is too often or too many times people, not Keyboard Ninja, but you go out there and it's like they throw out an idea and they haven't defined the problem they're trying to solve well enough. So their analysis, their conclusions may all be correct, but somebody else jumps in and says, hey, no, that's moronic. Why would you think that? And it's because they're thinking about the problem differently, and they're thinking, in essence, about an entirely different problem. And so it invites all sorts of disagreement and frustrations for people, I think. And for whatever reason, the forums all seem to be a great place to foster kind of that disgruntled, oh, you're stupid because you think this. And it's like, yeah, but that's not the problem I'm solving right now. I'm doing something different than what you're focusing on.
Well, and this is just a forums issue. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got the catch-22 where it's phenomenal for you guys to be putting this information out there, and we've all loved it. And you're putting out what your assumptions are and what you're working towards and what your goals are, and there are going to be people that just don't understand. But the flip side of that being, you're putting it all out there, and people can come to you, and if they intellectually grasp what it is that you're providing, they can contribute and change some of your own information and help you to vet and confirm that information, which is what we started this whole interview with, right?
Right. No, exactly.
I mean, trolls are a common thread. No matter what part of life you're in, if you're on the internet, you're going to have to deal with people that either don't get it or they just want to troll.
But I think that given the tool set that we have to share information as a community, I think that is something that we have to be aware of, that the forums are it. There's other fan sites out there which are great too, but having a discourse and trying to poke holes in people's assumptions and all, it's fantastic, but it becomes taxing. It becomes more difficult to do, given the fact that, this isn't like an academic setting or something where you can have a good discussion about things. So maybe this podcast will be a great opportunity to kind of counter some of that stuff, where we can have actual discussions.
Hey, I can tell you, I'll tell you guys flat out, if we start getting a whole bunch of feedback sent in to us and everything, we might have to just compile all of these questions and maybe have a follow-up.
There you go. You'll get feedback.